So we're going to turn to our research presentations for the afternoon now. And so we're delighted to have Kelley Packalen join us. She's a professor of entrepreneurship at the School of Business, and she's come from right around the corner in Finland, where she's on sabbatical. And so Kelley's going to join us, as is Alison Lobb, who was involved in her study from the Huron Small Business Enterprise Centre. So let's welcome Alison and Kelley. We got 30 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Jeff is right, and I hopefully will get through this presentation. I realized afterwards I should have asked for the morning slot because it is about 9 p.m., 9:30, right around when I usually am starting to head to bed. So hopefully I will be fine. But today what I want to talk to you about is helping entrepreneurs succeed. So this is a little bit of a turn in the topics. This morning we were focusing on technology, and technology is an aspect that will come out here, but it's not really the driving force. What I really am interested in is advisory relationships in government-funded programs. I think this is there we go. So governments, as you know, spend considerable money funding programs and centers that are designed really to help nascent entrepreneurs. And I'll get a list of those in a moment. There's centers that a number of you may actually have come from, or at least be familiar with in your community. They're throughout the province. They come under a variety of different names. And what we found from an academic standpoint is that a lot of the prior literature has really shown a mixed sort of support for this. Do these advisory relationships help? Is it money well spent? Is it not? And there's a lot of sort of uncertainty around that. One of the key services, and the one that I'm really interested in, is specifically this one-on-one counseling that happens between a client or a potential entrepreneur, a new entrepreneur. It could be even an established small business owner and the business advisors that are employed in these centers. And I'm looking at the types of advice. So what types of advice do they provide? And you can kind of put these into two big categories. One is, for lack of a better word, career development functions. And this is about how to write, how to update a business plan, all those sort of nitty-gritty things like do marketing plans, how do you file your taxes, what are some HR policies that you might be aware of, those sorts of things. And then there's this other thing that we call psychosocial functions. And that's really much more about helping the mentee, so in this case the client, the entrepreneur, to be established small business owner, to develop a sense of professional self. Who are they? What does it mean to be an entrepreneur? Providing them with friendship, providing them with counseling and mentorship, acting as a role model to them. So considerable advice has actually research has looked sort of at this type of research that's provided, how that can have an impact. But what hasn't been looked at as much, and something that I'm interested in, is career history. So how do people end up where they are, and how does that impact what they decide to do with their centers? So to give you an idea of the context, I spoke to, and I'll get into the numbers of who I spoke to thus far. These are the kinds of organizations that I talked to. And I should say as an aside, and this is relevant because of the technology. So I had planned to do these interviews before I left, and I'm coming back to our earlier presentation where there was right up at the front, 93% of all interactions are about nonverbal, 7% are about verbal. So I had planned to do these in person. And what would have happened is I would have gone up and down the 401 corridor, right? Because I would want to do these as day trips and interview people. Didn't happen. I ended up in Helsinki before these interviews started, so I had to do them by phone. And a really interesting thing happened because that all of a sudden freed me up to all of Ontario, where previously I would have restricted myself to the 401 corridor thinking, I need to be efficient at this. And I had wonderful conversations. And only in a certain few instances where the technology was bad. So in Finland, you have a very hard time finding a landline anymore, and this might be the Nokia effect. But there really is not one to be seen. I have not seen a landline all year. And so every once in a while I would have a bad cell phone connection, and I would end the conversation and call back and then be fine. And when the technology wasn't working, then those phone conversations became difficult. But for the most part, they were surprisingly easy and flowing and so much better than I could have ever expected. And I felt like I was able to even develop a rapport with those people. And so that's just when we're talking about the technology. Technology did have an effect if it was bad, but if it was working, I felt like I had as successful as an interview as I would have had in person, and in fact opened myself up to many more interesting conversations than I would have had otherwise. These people are also involved, getting back to the topic. So there's the regional innovation centers. Those are centers that are really sort of focused on high growth, high innovation businesses. And then there's the rural, the community futures development corporations, and all these small business enterprise. There's lots of different names. And there's a lot of different programs. So for youth, there's things like Summer Company, the Canadian Youth Business Foundation. For different regions, you have the CFDC loans, you have the Northern Heritage Fund, or Northern Ontario Heritage Fund Corporation. And then you have this program for EI recipients called the Small Self-Entrepreneurs Business Program. Is that correct?
Self-employment
program. This is why I have Alison here to help me. And it turns out that these programs offered influence the kind of activities in which the advisors engage. So I'll get back to that. So I've done a number of different interviews. This is the methodology slide, and this is the only one that I have here in terms of the academic side of the presentation. But I've spoken to 12 different advisors from 8 different centers, as well as 14 different directors and managers. I'm also really trying to interview clients, but to date I've only been able to interview one client. And I'll get back to this. This has been a challenge, and it gets back to actually one of my recommendations at the end. I'm finding that the clients really don't want to get involved in sometimes publicizing that they got help. And so they're not so willing to be interviewed to show recognition, even with the sort of the anonymous nature that goes around here. So what did I ask these people about? Well, I asked everyone about their career histories. And then from the directors, I really wanted to get an idea of how and these are also the managers of the center, or in the case of Alison, Alison's a one-man or one-woman show. You know, she is the manager of the center, but she is also the advisor. And this was very common in some of these smaller centers in more rural areas. But what was it? What programs were offered? How was the center organized? What were the types of activities? How many employees did they have? And when they hired advisors, if they hired advisors, sometimes they were already in place, what would they look for? What did they think was important in terms of who an advisor was? For the advisors themselves, I asked them, well, when you were hired, what did you think that this job was going to be about? What did you think was going to be important? And how has that maybe changed over time? I also asked them that if you could only discuss 2 or 3 things with a person who came in the door, that's all you had time for, you could only say 2 or 3 things to them, what would those 2 or 3 things be? Because I was trying to get at what was really emphasized, what was important to them. And then to get a lot of detail, I'd sort of say, okay, I don't want to know names, but I want to know your most rewarding client, your most challenging client, and sort of your typical client. And we would step through in detail what those interactions would like, how frequently they interacted, and what they talked about, and that really got a sense of sort of how these relationships evolved over time. So the first thing that I found is most of the directors and managers that I spoke to had a close connection to entrepreneurship. So they either themselves had been an entrepreneur in the past, or they had a family member. They came from a family where they'd grown up with a self-employed parent. They had grown up, their spouse is self-employed. So they had a close familiarity with that lifestyle. They typically had several career changes in their past, so this was not a first career for them, but something that they had come to. And they were often what we would classify as a jack of all trades. So they were willing to do really whatever it took in the center. So that's where I get the heading that the entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well in these centers. There was a credible diversity in terms of how offerings were made, whether they offered workshops, whether they offered seminars. It was wonderful to see. But at the same time, there was a lot, how the programs were offered was also influenced by the size of the center, the number of individuals in the geographical market served, which, again, coming back to Alison, in the case of some of these, particularly rural and northern Ontario regions, is incredibly large. You know, I'd just be astounded by the geographical width. You can't cover that in a day. You can't get to some of these communities very easily that are where they are serving. And so in some of those cases, they would use sort of varied uses of internet-supported learning. Some centers were really heavy on offering workshops. Other centers were getting involved in community events, either as hosting or participating in those and bringing people together. So what I found, perhaps not surprisingly, is that the directors and advisors' backgrounds influence what they value. So people come to an idea, people tend to like what you've come from. And so, in here, this case was that former entrepreneurs think that practical experience is essential. So they're only going to look for advisors who've previously been entrepreneurs in terms of what they think they need to do to be an advisor. Directors who grew up in the regions that they serve, and this was a theme that I heard this morning too, this idea of wanting people to come back. How many of those teachers, I think the comment was, are actually from the community? So people who have come from the community see that as being essential for them to do their job, that everyone knows who I am, I can go there, things are so much faster and easier and simpler for me to do because I'm already tapped into this community. When directors have come in from outside in the past, they really haven't had that same level of success. I should also say that this really influenced in terms of who they wanted to hire, who they were, and also what they valued. And so we'll come up to that in the middle in the next slide. So all advisors mentioned business knowledge is important. I mean, it's what you do, right? You in terms of if you're helping someone with a business plan, helping them with marketing, helping with them with finance, understanding that business knowledge and plan is really important. But I found that those who were close to entrepreneurs tended to emphasize the psychosocial types of advising more. So one advisor whom I spoke with, who had a spouse, and I'm going to quote what she said here in a minute, who was an entrepreneur, emphasized the importance of discussing what self-employment meant from an emotional standpoint, as well as the demands it would place on finances and family. So it wasn't just, is there a market for your product, but do you understand what this is going to do as well? So she said, I don't think that they necessarily come back, meaning I don't think that these people necessarily come back for a second appointment. So I really like to get a thorough understanding of my client's vision, and I will spend an hour with them going through that question and answer conversationally. This meeting also included making them aware of the lifestyle changes that might come about from being an entrepreneur, both to them personally as well as to those around them. So there was this influence, but in the end, and then those who had sort of first-hand experience as entrepreneurs really emphasized the need for this practical knowledge and making people know, do you understand your finances? Do you understand your marketing plan? In both cases, they often did both, but it was what was emphasized more, sort of in that if you only had 2 or 3 things to tell them, did any psychosocial sort of functions come up or not? In the end, though, I found that it was really the structure, and the structure that was often put in place, and I'll talk about 3 things that put this structure in place, that influenced whether or not these people had made things, the types of advice that they provided. So the first thing I noticed was the goals of the board of directors. And if the directors were focused, and so a lot of these have local funding sources, and those people form an advisory board to these centers. And if the directors were focused on numbers, then there was a push to do things that checked boxes and got those numbers. So one interview remarked to me that there was a push to help the entrepreneurs to get grants, which in turn forced them to advise to these grant applications. The person also noted that the directors, not the directors of the centers, but the board of directors, were less concerned with long-term outcomes. In other words, if the business failed, didn't really get off the ground, that was less relevant than the fact that, hey, you got a grant from this or that organization, or you were able to bring in a loan from this or that organization. The other thing was the specific programs offered. So I found that if people were assigned to a specific program, that's that SEB program that I mentioned, or Summer Company is another popular one, then I found that there was a fair amount of consistency from advisor to advisor in terms of what they said was important and what they emphasized. These interactions really tended to focus on helping the entrepreneur fill out the necessary worksheets, templates, what have you, that were required as part of that program. These people, again, may have engaged in these psychosocial functions as well, so I'm not saying that they did not do it at all, but it was not what was emphasized. And alternatively, though, advisors who weren't tied to a particular program seemed to be much more speak much more about the importance of helping the entrepreneur make the right decision for themselves in terms of whether or not entrepreneurship was right for them, whether this particular company or product that they were trying to start up was a viable opportunity. The regional innovation centers, if people are familiar with those, they have a different structure. So they have these entrepreneurs in residence who are very highly qualified, successful entrepreneurs who act as mentors. And then they also have staff analysts. And because of the way that those centers are set up, and I know it's not practical in many of the small businesses centers that also exist, they're able to outsource parts of sort of more task-oriented parts to workshops, webinars, to other staff analysts. And so they can really free up their time to focus on these more nuanced instances. So one regional innovation center, EIR, which is Entrepreneur in Residence, told me that during his early meetings with an entrepreneur, he said, I try to understand who they are as a person, what their values are and what their beliefs are, and why they started the business that they did. And then later on into when I asked him, well, what are the most important things that you can do? And he said the number one core element we talk about is that we need to be able to tell your story. Being able to articulate, to tell your story to whatever stakeholders you're talking to. So it can be employees, it can be partners, it could be customers, it could be inventors, whoever you can really get a handle on. If you can really get a handle on that, meaning telling the story, then you can become much more powerful. So to me, the story is the most important. And so that's what he really emphasized. And then the third aspect is this advising protocol. So some people talked about going through this APEX certification, training and certification program for small businesses. Another is the Soroli methodology, which is used, I've been involved with that in Kingston and some of the surrounding areas use that as well. So for those who aren't familiar, the Soroli methodology is really about finding out what the entrepreneur is good and passionate about, and then helping them find individuals to fill in the other pieces. It's not about completing a business plan. And I'm conscious of my time, so I'm going to move on to the recommendations here. So to government sponsors, I would say number one recommendation are to minimize change and simplify processes. None of the people that I spoke to had extra time. I was amazed at all of the things that they were tasking jungling. And so some change is necessary, but a number of them spoke about the unnecessary amount of paperwork that they had to complete and changes that were made sometimes. And to the boards of directors and funders, I would say avoid pushing growth for growth's sake. And this comes back to that example that I said to you before, talking about entrepreneurs who felt like they had to get the numbers for the sake of getting the numbers. And so one said, the board's main goal, how much funding did you help clients get? How much financing did they leverage? How many new jobs were created? And that, of course, is an important metric. So she's acknowledging the importance of that. But at the same time, in a way, you might be setting the entrepreneur up for failure. More generally, advisors consider it a success if they've helped a client decide to start a business or decide to not start a business. But it's only the former, the starting a business, that gets included in the metrics. And then more generally, understand that people don't always want to publicize their support. So one director noted with frustration that we've helped all these people in the community, but no one wants to admit that they got help from us. So when we report back to our board of directors, we have a hard time because we're sort of bound by this confidentiality in terms of who we've helped as clients. And then to the directors and advisors, I would say continue to put the entrepreneur first. One manager noted, being grassroots, we're really driven by the people we serve, not by boards and not by other managers, but from people on the ground who tell us this is what we need. And then using technology to the extent and other creative solutions. So one advisor said, well, I use the technology almost as a homework to weed out those who aren't interested. So when they come in for the first appointment, he sends them off to do a number of different templates. And if they fill them out and come back, then he knows that they're serious. And it's a way for him to kind of be able to spend his time with those who are more serious as opposed to those who are less serious. And then Alison, for example, does a number of really interesting sort of networking activities that get individuals within the community engaging directly with one another so that the advisor doesn't always have to be the middleman between those two groups. So on that note, I will turn it over to Alison.
How do we move the slides forward?
There you go, just push.
one? Okay. Okay, well, I tell you, I have the best job in the world. I am an advisor, a business advisor for the County of Huron, and I operate the Small Business Enterprise Center in Seaforth. And it is jointly funded by MEDTE, the Ministry of Economic Development, Trade and Employment, and the County of Huron. And we're all part of that one organization. I do believe that practical experience is important, and I emphasize the practical. I put that slide together just to show you my volunteer or other activities that are totally unrelated to my job. I'm the mother of 5 kids. I'm a cash crop farmer. I'm an author. I've been a municipal councillor for 19 years. I'm vice chair of the Community Futures Organization and connected with all the other ones that are there. But it's important, I think I skipped, no, it's important to take a look at what the area is that I'm dealing with. It's very rural. I often say in my handout that we have only 17 stoplights in the whole of our county of 60,000. And I'm sure in urban areas that you can't get your head around. We do have a problem with population slightly decreasing, and certainly the out-migration of youth is something we're very concerned about. We're very definitely agriculture. That's our strongest pillar, and we have the highest agricultural returns in the province. We do have a high rate of entrepreneurship, 18% compared to a provincial rate of 10% in 2011. And our unemployment rate is lower. And that's something that I've heard people in my area laud as being wonderful. And I would have to say, personally, I hesitate when that happens, because I'm not at all sure that the reason the unemployment rate is lower in Huron isn't so much because everybody has a job, as they may have given up or left. I do find that my rate of consultations decreases as the rate gets lower. But I did have one stat there. In 2012, there were 6,119 businesses registered, according to Stats Canada. And 1 year later, there were 740 additional businesses registered. And those are only the ones that are registered, and a lot of them aren't registered, of course. We have a number of mandated programs for the aspects: the one-on-one confidential consultations, the summer company for youth 15 to 29, and they run a business during the summer. And what better way to teach your youth to be entrepreneurs and come back? However, I have to tell you that for many years we've tried to get the Board of Education to give it a credit. I mean, they're certainly working hard enough for a credit, and it was tried once in Waterloo, extremely successful. And then the teachers' union said, you can only carry that in our schools if it's taught by a teacher who's part of the union. So the project died. Now, my understanding is that they're looking at it as potentially a co-op credit, which to me would be marvelous. And it's been hard work on the part of our ministry to get that kind of acknowledgement. We also have a new grant program starting, the Starter Program for youth again, 18 to 29. And we normally have some kind of a Bridges to Better business event, a trade show or something along that line. But in Huron, I know I've always had a workshop series, an evening workshop series. We have about 25 workshops in a year. We have the Self-Employment Benefit Program that I'm involved with. And I have a women's networking dinner, which we call HWIN. We have probably 50 to 60 women twice a year come out to that event, and we've seen business occur as a result. They talked about whether or not it was cost effective. And I can tell you that I have interacted from 1993 to 2013 with 38,741 clients. That works out to, based on the ministry core funding. Okay, now recognize that we access additional funding, but the ministry core funding works out to an average of $235 a contact. From 2007 to 2013, I tracked a total of 1780 confidential consults. That's the one-on-one ones that are an hour or 2 hours. An average of 254 a year at a cost of $270 a consult. And during that time, I reported 423 business startups, which works out, based on the ministry core funding, $1,135. So to me, I think that's pretty cost effective compared to other things I've seen. And you've got to realize that that isn't taking into account the other work that I do. The workshop series, a trade show, the summer company program, the SEB program, the networking time, and I might add, all the administration, which is very time consuming. The consultations, I would say, primarily are service. 44% were service related in 2012. They're usually one-man or one-woman shops with no employees. They've never completed a business plan or even seen one, and they have no idea how to start a cash flow projection. I provide direction and focus, and I insist them to start documenting their ideas, and I encourage them. But having said that, it's the advisor's job to make sure that reality is brought into play, because some of them haven't got to that stage. Now, the disconnects or the concerns that I see for the funders, it is a numbers game. They're looking at the numbers, and I'm not sure how you change that. But I would have to say that personally, to me, if I spend 3 consults with an individual an hour each, and at the end of that, they determine that they'd better continue with their employment and not take a flyer at starting their own business, that's a success to me. Because if they'd gone ahead and started, they wouldn't have been there for very many years. And I would rather see that happen than have them go ahead. The other thing I'm finding is that recognition is paramount to the funders. I was recently turned down for a grant application for a Women's Day event that would have been absolutely perfect. It was 2 organizations that were going on to honor inspiring women, giving out 2 awards. Wonderful event, which did go ahead. And I applied for funding and I was turned down, basically, I believe, because the SPEC name wasn't at the top. The recognition was not going to be totally to the SPEC, and so they weren't prepared to fund it. That's short-sighted to me. Funders also seem to be wanting more and more for volunteers to do the work. And by that I mean unpaid volunteers to do the work. They want mentors for the summer company program, they want mentors for the starter program, and they want them all to be unpaid. And I would have to say that those volunteers are very important to our programming, absolutely critical. And they certainly have the expertise, the experience, but should we put no value at all on their time? Consultants want to see viable businesses succeed. Mentors want to have the contribution valued. And there must be a purpose in what they do. They should be matched, not just selected because they've got free time. They should be matched to the person who needs the service. And clients really expect to be listened to. That's really important to them. They want to receive helpful assistance and opportunities for growth. So my conclusion, one-on-one consultations are critical. And I think that group sessions have a place, but they don't provide the confidentiality of one-on-ones. Don't underestimate the value of practical experience. And program designers need to understand entrepreneurship. At one point in time in the summer company program, when you prepared a cash flow and said you were going to spend $300 on something, if you got a deal and spent $200, you'd have been docked $100. Took us 3 years to change that. Now, I mean, what are you teaching here? Entrepreneurship? Value your volunteers. Provide training opportunities to develop their skills. That's going to be an important asset to them. And appreciate what constitutes success, not just the numbers. And Paul Nickel at the Community Futures in the same building I'm in said, entrepreneurs are born, not made. But the role of the advisor is to develop that underlying or emerging sense of entrepreneurship and bring it out to fruition. And I think he's said it all. That's what the entrepreneur needs to do.